Yeah, much better. Yeah, that should be alright. Death World Base. I need Agrax, nurgle, bronze. Yeah, how's it going, dude? Yeah, for nurgle. I'm just getting my paints out. Bronze. What have I got? There we go. Alright. Yeah, screaming bad. It'll just be plague marine to start with, bro. And you can't go wrong with plague marines, mind you. With the poxwalkers, I'm gonna have to just come up with it on the spot, to be fair.
This is audible.
Right.
First and only. Written by Dan Abbott. Read by Tony.
I've never actually gone live before, neither. So, hey, there we go. And how's your day going, anyways?
The High Lords of Terror, lauding the great War Master Slado's efforts on Coolan, tasked him with raising a crusade force to liberate the Sabbath world.
Where's my dry brush?
Along the edge of the segmented Pacific. From a massive fleet deployment.
This one will work, yep.
The Sabbath worlds, supported by forces of the Adeptus Astartes and the Adeptus Mechanicus, with whom Slado had formed cooperative pacts. After 10 hard-fought years of dogged advance, Slado's great victory came in Valhalla. Opened the way to
this is a bit awkward with oh, the camera is.
But there, Slado fell. Bickering and rivalry then beset his officers.
That's not cool. Lift that end up. There we go.
Was an obvious successor, but Slado himself had chosen the younger commander, Makarov. With Makarov as War Master, the Crusade force pushed on into its second decade and deeper into the Sabbath world, facing theaters of war that began to make Valhalla seem like a mere opening skirmish. From a history of the later Imperial Crusades. Part 1. Nubular Reach. The two Faustus-class interceptors swept in low over 1,000 slowly spinning tons of jade asteroids and decelerated to coasting velocity. striated blurs of ship-speed light flickered off their gun-metal hulls. The saffron haze of the nebula, called the Nubular Reach, hung as a spread backdrop for 1,000 light years wide.
Cheers, dude. Cheers, dude.
Which enfolded the edges of the satellite worlds. Each of these patrol interceptors was an elegant bar of about 100 paces from jutting nose to raked tail. The Faustus were lean, powerful warships that looked like serrated cathedral spires with splayed flying buttresses in the rear to house the main thrusters. Their armored flanks bore the imperial eagle, together with the green markings and insignia of the Segmentum Pacificus. Locked in the hydraulic arrestor struts of the command seat in the lead ship, Wing Captain Taunton Lahane forced down his heart rate as the ship decelerated. Synchronous mind impulse links bequeathed by the Adeptus Mechanicus hooked his metabolism to the ship's ancient systems, and he lived and breathed every nuance of its motion, power output, and response. Lahane was a 20-year veteran. He'd piloted Faustus interceptors for so long, they seemed an extension of his body. He glanced down into the flight annex directly below and behind the command seat, where his observation officer was at work at the navigation station. Well, he asked over the intercom. The observer checked off his calculations against several glowing runes on the board. Steer 5 points starboard. The astropath's instructions are to sweep down the edge of the gas clouds for a final look, and then it's back to the fleet. Behind him, there was a murmur. The astropath, hunched in his small throne cradle, stirred. Hundreds of filament leads linked the astropath's socket-encrusted skull to the massive sensory apparatus in the Faustus's belly. Each one was marked with a small, yellowing parchment label, inscribed with words Lahane didn't want to have to read. There was the cloying smell of incense and unguents. What did he say? Lahane asked. The observer shrugged. Who knows? Who wants to? He said. The astropath's brain was constantly surveying and processing the vast wave of astronomical data which the ship's sensors pumped into it, and psychically probing the warp beyond. Small patrol ships like this, with their astropathic cargo, were the early warning arm of the fleet. The work was hard on the Psyker's mind, and the odd moan or grimace was commonplace. There had been worse. They'd gone through a nickel-rich asteroid field the previous week, and the Psychic had got into spasms. Flight check, Lahane said into the intercom. Tail turret, aye, crackled back the servitor at the rear of the ship. Flight engineer ready, by the Emperor, buzzed the voice of the engine chamber. Lahane signaled his wingman. Moselle, you run forward and begin the sweep. We'll lag away behind you as a double check. Then we'll pull for home. Mark that, the pilot of the other ship replied, and his craft gunned forward, a sudden blur that left twinkling pearls in its wake. Lahane was about to kick in behind when the voice of the astropath came over the link. It was rare for the man to speak to the rest of the crew. Captain, move to the following coordinates and hold. I am receiving a signal. A message. Source unknown. Lahane did as he was instructed, and the ship banked around, motors flaring in quick white bursts. The observer swung all the sensor arrays to bear. What is this? Lahane asked, impatient. Unscheduled maneuvers off a carefully set
Yeah, so it's just me and you then, Mike, is it?
The astropath took a moment to respond, clearing his throat. It is an astropathic communique, struggling to get through the warp. It is coming from extreme long range. I must gather it and relay it to fleet command. Why? Lahane said. This was all too irregular. I sense it is secret. It is primary level intelligence. It is vermilion level. There was a long pause.
I'm just going to go grab my glutes upstairs.
Broken only by the hum of the drive, the chatter of the
Yeah, give me 2 seconds.
Vermilion. Lahane breathed. Vermilion was the highest clearance level used by the Crusade's cryptographers. It was unheard of, mythical. Even main battle schemes usually only warranted a magenta. He felt an icy tightness in his wrists, a tremor in his heart. Sympathetically, the interceptor's reactor fibrillated. Lahane swallowed. A routine day had just become very unroutine. He knew he had to commit everything to the correct and efficient recovery of this data. How long do you need? He asked over the link. Another pause. The ritual will take not disturb me as I concentrate. I need as long as possible, the astropath said. There was a phlegmy, strained edge to his voice. In a moment, that voice was murmuring. The air temperature in the cabin dropped perceptibly. Something. Lahane flexed his grip on the rudder stick, his skin turning to goose flesh. He hated the witchcraft of the cycle. He could taste it in his mouth. Bitter, sharp. Cold sweat beaded under his flight mask. Hurry up, he thought. It was taking too long. They were idling and vulnerable, and he wanted his skin to stop crawling. The astropath's murmured prayer continued. Lahane looked out of the canopy at the swathe of pinkish mist that folded away from him into the heart of the nebula, a billion kilometers away. The cold, stabbing light of ancient suns slanted and shafted through it like dawn light on gossamer. Dark-bellied clouds swirled in slow, silent blossoms. Contacts, the observer yelled suddenly. 3, no, 4, fast as hell and coming straight in. Lahane snapped to attention. Angle and lead time. The observer rattled out a set of coordinates, and Lahane steered the nose towards them. They're coming in fast, the observer repeated. Throne of Earth, but they're
Oh dear, I
moving.
just managed to stick my fingers
Lahane
together.
looked
Bloody
across
hell.
his oversweep board,
Right,
saw the runic
where was
cursors
I?
flashing as they edged into the tactical grid. Defense system activated. Weapons to ready, he barked. Drum autoloaders chattered in the chin turret forward of him as he armed the autocannons, and energy reservoirs whined as they powered up the main forward-firing plasma guns. Wing 2 to Wing 1, Moselle's voice rasped over the long-range Voxcaster. They're all over me.
Welcome,
Break and run.
welcome.
Break and run in the name of the Emperor. The other interceptor was coming at him at close to full thrust. Lahane's enhanced optics, amplified and linked via the canopy's systems, saw Moselle's ship while it was still 1,000 kilometers away. Behind it, lazy and slow, came the vampiric shapes, the predatory ships of chaos. Fire patterns winked in the russet darkness, yellow traceries of venomous death. Moselle's scream abruptly ended, tore through the Voxcast. The racing interceptor disappeared in a rapidly expanding, superheated fireball. The 3 attackers thundered on through the firewash. They're coming for us! Bring her about! Lahane yelled and threw the Faustus round, gunning the engines. How much longer? He bellowed at the astropath. The communique is received. I am now relaying, the astropath gasped, at the edge of his limits. Fast as you can, we have no time, Lahane said. The sleek-moving ship blinked forward, thrust drive roaring. Lahane rejoiced at the singing of the engine in his blood. He was pushing the threshold tolerances of the ship. Amber alert sigils were lighting his display.
That's a bit easier. There we go.
The cracked ancient leather of his command chair. In the tail turret, the gunner servitor traversed the twin autocannons, hunting for a target. He didn't see the attackers, but he saw their absence, the flickering darkness against the stars. The turret guns screamed into life, blitzing out a scarlet-tinged, boiling stream of hypervelocity fire. Indicators screamed shrill warnings in the cockpit. The enemy had obtained multiple target lock. Down below, the observer was bawling up at Lahane, demanding evasion procedures. Over the link, flight engineer Manus was yelling something about a stress injection leak. Lahane was serene. Is it done? He asked the astropath calmly. There was another long pause. The astropath was lolling weakly in his cradle, near to death, his brain ruined by the trauma of the act. He murmured, It is finished. Lahane wrenched the interceptor in a savage loop and presented himself to the pursuers with the massive forward plasma array and the nose guns blasting. He couldn't outrun them or outfight them, but by the Emperor he'd take at least one with him before he went. The chin turret spat 1,000 heavy bolter rounds a second. The plasma guns howled phosphorescent death into the void. One of the shadow shapes exploded in a bright blister of flame, its shredded fuselage and mainframe splitting out, carried along by the burning, incandescent bow wave of igniting propellant. Lahane scored a second kill, too. He ripped open the belly of another attacker, spilling its pressurized guts into the void. It burst like a swollen balloon, spinning round under the shuddering impact and spewing its contents in a fire trail behind itself. A second later, A rain of toxic and corrosive warheads, each a sliver of metal like a dirty needle, raked the Faustus end to end. They detonated the astropath's head and explosively atomized the observer out through the punctured hull. Another killed the flight engineer outright and destroyed the reactor interlock. 2 milliseconds after that, stress fractures shattered the Faustus-class interceptor like a glass bottle. A super-dense explosion boiled out from the core, vaporizing the ship and Lahane with it. The corona of the blast rippled out for 80 kilometers until it vanished in the nebulous haze. A memory. Darandara, 20 years earlier. The Winter Palace was besieged. In the woods on the north shore of the frozen lake, the field guns of the Imperial Guard thumped and rumbled.
Should be
Snow
alright. Let me change
thundered
my
down,
brush.
and each shuddering retort brought heavier falls slumping down from the tree limbs. Brass shell cases clanked as they spun out of the returning breaches and fell, smoking into snow cover that was quickly becoming trampled slush. Over the lake, the palace crumbled. One wing was now ablaze, and shell holes were appearing shore, bursting the ice skin of the lake and sending up cold geysers of water, mud, and sharp chunks that looked like broken glass. Commissar
No, I need to go back to the big brush.
chief political officer of the higher
That
camp
little
regiment,
brush don't work.
stood in the back of his winter camouflage painted half-track and watched the demolition through his field scope. When Fleet Command had sent the Hyakins in to quell the uprising on Darandara, he had known it would come to this. A bloody, bitter end. How many opportunities had they given the successionists to surrender? Too many, according to that rat turd, Colonel Drevier, who commanded the armoured brigades in support of the Hyakin infantry. That would be a matter Drevier would gleefully report in his dispatches, Oktar knew. Drevier was a career soldier with the pedigree of noble blood, who was gripping the ladder of advancement so tightly with both hands that his feet were free to kick out at those on lower rungs. Oktar didn't care. The victory mattered, not the glory. As a Commissar General, his authority was well liked, and no one doubted his loyalty to the Imperium, his resolute adherence to the primary dictates, or the rousing fury of his speeches to the men. But he believed war was a simple thing, where caution and restraint could win far more for less cost. He had seen the reverse too many times before. The command echelons generally believed in the theory of attrition when it came to the Imperial Guard. Any foe could be ground into pulp if you threw enough at them, and the Guard was, to them, a limitless supply of cannon fodder for just such a purpose. That was not Oktar's way. He had schooled the officer cadre of the Hyakins to believe it too.
Alright, see ya.
And his staff to value every man.
Can't hear ya.
Of the 6,000 Hyakins, many by name. Oktar had been with them from the start, from the first founding on the high plateau of Hyak, those vast, gale-racked industrial deserts of granite and grassland. 6 regiments they had founded there, 6 proud regiments, and just the first of what Oktar hoped would be a long line of Hyakin soldiers who would set the name of their planet high on the honor roll of the Imperial Guard, from founding to founding. They were brave boys. He would not waste them, and he would not have the officers waste them. He glanced down from his half-track into the tree lines where the gun teams serviced their thumping limbers. The Hyakin were a strong breed, drawn and pale, with almost colourless hair, which they preferred to wear short and severe. They wore dark grey battle dress with beige webbing and short-billed forage caps of the same pale hue. In this cold theatre, they also had woven gloves and long greatcoats. Those labouring at the guns, though, were stripped down to their beige undershirts, their webbing hanging loosely around their hips as they bent and carried shells, and braced for firing in the close heat of the concussions. It looked odd, in these snowy wastes, with breath
Welcome to the
steaming in
live.
air, to see
How you
men
doing?
moving through gunsmoke in thin shirts, hot and ruddy with sweat. He knew their strengths and weaknesses to a man, knew exactly who best to send forward to reconnoiter, to snipe, to lead a charge offensive, to scout for mines, to cut wire, to interrogate prisoners. He valued each and every man for his abilities in the field of war. He would not waste them. He and General Canava would use them, each one in his particular way, and they would win and win and win again, 100 times more than any who used his regiments like bullet soaks in the bloody front line. Men like Dravir. Oktar dreaded to think what that beast might do when finally given field command of an action like this. Let the little piping runt in his starched collar sound off to the high brass about him. Let him make a fool of himself. This wasn't his victory to win. Oktar jumped down from the vehicle's flatbed and handed his scope to the sergeant. "Where's the boy?" he asked, in his soft, penetrating tones. The sergeant smiled to himself, knowing the boy hated to be known as the boy. "Supervising the batteries on the rise, Commissar General," he said in a faultless low Gothic, flavoured with the clipped guttural intonations of the Hayek homeworld accent. "Send him to me," Oktar said, rubbing his hands gently to encourage circulation. "I think it's time he got a chance to advance himself." The sergeant turned to go, then paused. "Advance himself, Commissar? Or advance himself?" Oktar grinned like a wolf. "Both, naturally." The Hayakan sergeant bounded up the ridge to the field guns at the top, where the trees...
Welcome to the live. How do you do?
...by a successionist airstrike. The splintered trunks were denuded back to their pale bark, and the ground under the snow was thick with wood pulp, twigs, and uncountable fragrant needles. There would be no more airstrikes, of course. Not now. The Successionist Air Force had been operating out of 2 airstrips south of the Winter Palace, which had been rendered useless by Colonel Dravir's armoured units. Not that they'd had much to begin with. Maybe 60 ancient pattern slamjets with cycling cannons in the armpits of the wings and struts on the wingtips for the few bombs they could muster. The sergeant had cherished a sneaking admiration for the Successionist flyers, though. They tried damn hard, taking huge risks to drop their payloads where it counted, and without the advantage of good air-to-ground instrumentation. He would never forget the slamjet which took out their communications bunker in the snow lines of the mountain a fortnight before. It had passed low twice to get a fix, bouncing through the frag bursts which the anti-air batteries threw up all around it. He could still see the faces of the pilot and the gunner as they passed, plainly visible because the canopy was hauled back so they could get a target by sight alone. Brave. Desperate. Not a whole lot of difference in the sergeant's book. Determined, too. That was the Commissar General's view. They knew they were going to lose this war before it even started, but still they tried to break loose from the Imperium. The sergeant knew that Oktar admired them, and in turn he admired the way Oktar had urged the Chief of Staff to give the rebels every chance to surrender. What was the point of killing for no purpose? Still, the sergeant had shuddered when the 3,000-pounder had fishtailed down into the communications bunker and flattened it, just as he had cheered when the thumping, traversing quad barrels of the Hydra anti-air batteries had pegged the slamjet as it pulled away. It looked like it had been kicked from behind, jerking up at the tail and then tumbling end over end as it exploded and burned in a long dying fall into the distant trees. The sergeant reached the hilltop and caught sight of the boy. He was standing amidst the batteries, hefting fresh shells into the arms of the gunners from the stockpiles half buried under blast curtains. Tall, pale, lean and powerful, the boy intimidated the sergeant. Unless death claimed him first, the boy would one day become a commissar in his own right. Until then, he enjoyed the rank of cadet commissar and served his tutor Oktar with enthusiasm and boundless energy. Like the Commissar General, the boy wasn't Hayakan. The sergeant thought then, for the first time, that he didn't even know where the boy was from. And the boy probably didn't know either. "The Commissar General wants you," he told the boy as he reached him. The boy grabbed another shell from the pile and swung it round to the waiting gunner. "Did you hear me?" the sergeant asked. "I heard," said Cadet Commissar Ibram Gaunt. He knew he was being tested. He knew that this was his responsibility, and that he'd better not mess it up. Gaunt also knew that it was his moment to prove to his mentor Oktar that he had the makings of a commissar. There was no set duration for the training of a cadet. After education at the Schola Progenium and Guard basic training, a A cadet received the rest of his training in the field, and the promotion to full commissarial level was a judgment matter for his commanding officer. Oktar, and Oktar alone, could make him or break him. His career as an imperial commissar to dispense discipline, inspiration, and the love of the God Emperor of Terra to the greatest fighting force in creation hinged upon him.
Hey Mike, if you're watching this, I just realised
Gaunt was an intense, quiet
you're
man,
wanting the other boxes
and
painted up as
commissarial
well.
post had been his
Jesus
dearest
Christ, that's a lot of Death Guard,
since his earliest
dude.
days in the Skoda Progenitor.
How many points are you aiming
But he
for?
trusted Oktar to be fair. The Commissar General had personally selected him for service from the Cadet Honor Class, and had become, in the last 18 months, almost a father to Gaunt. A stern, ruthless father, perhaps. The father he had never really known. See that burning wing, Oktar had said. That's a way in. The successionists must be falling back into their inner chambers by now. General Canava and I propose putting a few squads in through that hole and cutting out their center. Are you up to it? Gaunt had paused, his heart in his throat. Sir, you want me to lead them in? Yes. Don't look so shocked, Ibram. You're always asking me for a chance to prove your leadership. Who do you want? My choice. Your choice. Men from the 4th Brigade. Tannhaus is a good squad leader, and his men are specialists in room-to-room fighting. Give me them, and Reichlin's heavy weapons team. Good choices, Ibram. Prove me right. They moved past the fire and into long halls decorated with tapestries, where the wind moaned and light fell slantwise from the high windows. Cadet Gaunt led the men personally, as Oktar would have done, the lasgun held tightly in his hands, his blue-trimmed cadet commissar uniform perfectly turned out. In the 5th hallway, the successionists began their last-ditch counterattack. Las fire cracked and blasted at them. Cadet Gaunt ducked behind an antique sofa that swiftly became a pile of antique matchwood. Tannhaus moved up behind him. What now? The lean, corded Hayeken major asked. Give me grenades, Gaunt said. They were provided. Gaunt took the webbing belt and the timers on all 20 grenades. Haul up Waltham, he told Tannhaus. Trooper Waltham moved up. Gaunt knew he was famous in the regiment for the power of his throw. He'd been a javelin champion back home in a tiny grunt. 60 paces down.
Oh, I'll have a parcel here soon. Terrific.
They moved in, through the drifting smoke and masonry dust. The spirit had left the successionist defense. They found Degred, the rebel leader, lying dead with his mouth fused around the barrel of his lasgun. Gaunt signaled to General Canava and Commissar General Oktar that the fight was over. He marshaled the prisoners out with their hands on their heads as Hayeken troops set about disabling gun emplacements and munition stores. What do we do with her? Tannhaus asked him. Gaunt turned from the assault cannon he had been stripping of its firing pin. The girl was lovely, white-skinned and black hair, as was the pedigree of the Darandarans. She clawed at the clenching hands of the Hayeken troops hustling her and other prisoners down the drafty hallway. When she saw Gaunt, she stopped dead. He expected vitriol, anger, the verbal abuse so common in the defeated and imprisoned, whose beliefs and cause had been crushed. But what he saw in her face froze him in surprise. Her eyes were glassy, deep, like polished marble. There was a look in her face as she stared back at him. Gaunt shivered when he realized
Thank you.
the look
Hey, how you doing?
was recognition. There will be 7, she said suddenly, speaking surprisingly perfect High Gothic, with no trace of the local accent. The voice didn't seem to be her own. It was guttural, and its words did not match the movement of her lips. 7 stones of power. Cut them, and you will be free. Do not kill them, but first you must find your ghosts. Enough of your madness, Tannhaus snapped, then ordered the men to take her away. The girl was vacant-eyed by now, and froth dribbled down her chin. She was plainly sliding into the throes of a trance. The men were wary of her, and pushed her along at arm's length, scared of her magic. The temperature in the hallway itself seemed to drop. At once, the breaths of all the men steamed the air. It smelled heavy, burnt and metallic, the way it did before a storm. Gaunt felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He could not take his eyes off the murmuring girl, as the men bustled her away gingerly. The Inquisition will deal with her, Tannhaus shivered. Another untrained psycho witch working for the enemy. Wait, Gaunt said, and strode over to her. He tensed, scared of the supernaturally touched being he confronted. What do you mean? 7 stones. Ghosts. Her eyes rolled back, pupilless. The cracked old voice bubbled out of her quivering lips. The warp knows you, Ram. She stepped back, as if he had been stung. How did you know my name? She didn't answer. Not coherently, anyway. She began to thrash, gibber, and spit. Nonsense words and animal sounds issued from her shuddering throat. Take her away, Tannhaus barked. One man stepped in, then spun to his knees, flailing, blood streaming from his nose. She had done nothing but glance at him. Snarling oaths and protective charms, the others laid in with the butts of their lasguns. Gaunt watched the corridor for 5 full minutes after the girl had been dragged away. The air remained cold long after she had disappeared. He looked around at the drawn, anxious face of Tannhaus. Paid no heed, the Harkin veteran said, trying to sound confident. He could see the cadet was spooked. Just inexperienced, he was sure. Once the boy had seen a few years, a few campaigns, he'd learned to shut out the mad ravings of the foe and their tainted, insane rants. It was the only way to sleep at night. Gaunt was still tense. What was that about? He asked, as if he hoped that Tannhaus could explain the girl's words. Rubbish is what? Forget it, sir. Right. Forget it. Right. But Gaunt never did. Part 2. Fortis Binary Forge World. 1. The night sky was matte and dark, like the material of the fatigues they wore, day after day. The dawn stabbed in, as silent and sudden as a night wind, welling up a dull redness through the black cloth of the sky. Eventually, the sun rose, casting raw amber light down over the trench lines. The star was big, heavy and red, like a rotten roasted fruit. Dawn lightning crackled 1,000 kilometers away. Colum Corbeck woke, acknowledged briefly the 1,000 aches and snarls in his limbs and frame, and rolled out of his billet in the trench dugout. His great booted feet kissed into the grey slime of the trench floor, where the duckboards didn't meet. Corbeck was a large man on the wrong side of 40, built like an ox and going to fat. His broad and hairy forearms were decorated with blue spiral tattoos, and his beard was thick and shaggy. He wore the black webbing and fatigues of the Tanith, and also the ubiquitous camo cloak, which had become their trademark. He also shared the pale complexion, black hair, and blue eyes of his people. He was the colonel of the Tanith First and Only, the so-called Gaunt's Ghosts. He yawned. Down the trench, under the frag sack and gabion breastwork and the spools of rusting razor wire, the ghosts awoke too. There were coughs, gasps, soft yelps as nightmares became real in the light of waking. Matches struck under the low bevel of the parapet. Firearms were unswaddled and the damp cleaned up. Firing mechanisms were slammed in and out. Food parcels were unhooked from their vermin-proof positions up on the billet roofs. Shuffling in the ooze, Corbeck stretched and cast an eye down the long, zigzag traverses of the trench to see where the picket sentries were returning, pale and weary, asleep on their feet. The twinkling lights of the vast communication uplink masts flashed 11 kilometers behind them, rising between the rusting, shell-pocked roofs of the gargantuan shipyard silos and the vast Titan fabrication bunkers and foundry sheds of the Adeptus Mechanicus tech priesthood. The dark stealth capes of the picket sentries, the distinctive uniform of the Tanith First and Only, were lank and stiff with dried mud. Their replacements of the picket, bleary-eyed and puffy, slapped them on the arms as they passed, exchanging jokes and cigarettes. The night sentries, though, were too weary to be forthcoming. They were ghosts, returning to their graves, Corbeck thought, as are we all. In a hollow under the trench wall, Mad Larkin, the first squad's wiry sniper, was cooking up something that approximated caffeine in a battered tin tray for a fusion burner. The acrid stink hooked Corbeck by the nostrils. Give me some of that, Larks, the colonel said, squelching across the trench. Larkin was a skinny, stringy, unhealthily pale man in his 50s, with 3 silver hoops through his left ear and a purple-blue spiral worm tattoo on his sunken right cheek. He offered up a misshapen metal cup. There was a fragile look of fatigue and fear in his wrinkled eyes. This morning, do you reckon? This morning. Corbeck pursed his lips, enjoying the warmth of the cup in his head.
Should have sorted the chat out.
His voice trailed.
Yeah, I think so.
High in the orange troposphere, a matched pair of Imperial fighters streaked over, curved around the lines, and plumed away north.
That should be right.
Fighters go
There we go.
and sipped his feet. It was almost
They're still
unbearable
drying, and
a kilometre off, down the etched zigzag of the trench line, Trooper Falk was busily going crazy. Major Rawn, the regiment's second officer, was woken by the sound of a lasgun firing at close range, the phosphorescent impacts ringing into frag sacks and mud.
let me go
Rawn spun out of
prime
his cramped
something
billet
quickly.
as his adjutant, Fagor, stumbled up nearby. The shouts and oaths from the men around
I'm
him,
just going to go prime something quickly. I'll be 2 minutes. I can't do it down here, or I'm going to
chewing into the plastic seal
have to
with
put
their snapping
my
lizard
respirator on. And I'd rather not do
Up and
that.
down the trench, the animals skittered away past him, lopping on their big rabbit legs, their lice-ridden pelts smeared flat with ooze. Falk was firing his lasgun on full auto into his sleeping cavity under the bullet, screaming obscenities at the top of his fractured voice. Fagor got there first, wrestling the weapon from the bawling trooper. Falk turned his fists on the adjutant, mashing his nose, splashing up grey mud water with his scrambling boots. Rawn slid in past Fagor and put Falk out. Rawn slid in past Fagor and put Falk out with a hook to the jaw. There was a crack of bone and the trooper went down, whimpering, in the drainage gully. Assemble a firing squad detail. Rawn spat at the bloody Fagor unceremoniously and stalked back to his dugout.
2 floatoid drones and a crawler. That's what I'll be priming.
Unarguably the largest of ghosts. He was a peaceable. They called him Try Again Brad because of his terrible pain. He did not sit all night, and now his bed was singing a lullaby he couldn't resist. He slammed into young Trooper Catherine at the turn in the dugout and almost knocked the smaller man flat. Bragg hauled him up, his weariness clamming his apologies in his mouth. No harm done, Try, Catherine said. Get your billet. Bragg blundered on. 2 paces more, and he'd even forgotten what he'd done. He simply had an after-image memory of an apology he should have made to a good friend. Fatigue was total. Catherine ducked down into the crevice of the command dugout, just off the 3rd communication trench. There was a thick polyfiber shield over the door, and layers of anti-gas curtaining. He knocked twice, and then pulled back the heavy drapes, and dropped into the deep cavity. 2. The officer's dugout was deep, accessed only by an aluminium ladder lashed to the wall. Inside, the light was a frosty white from the sodium burners. The floor was well made of duckboards, and there were even such marks of civilization as shelves, books, charts, and an aroma of decent caffeine. Sliding down into the command burrow, Catherine noticed first Rin Milo, the 16-year-old mascot the Ghosts had acquired at their founding. Word was Milo had been rescued personally from the fires of their homeworld by the Commissar himself, and this bond had led him to his status of regimental musician and adjutant to their senior officer. Catherine didn't like to be around the boy much. There was something about his youth and his brightness of eye that reminded him of the world they had lost. It was ironic. Back on Tanith, with only a year or 2 between them, they, like as not, would have been friends. Milo was setting out breakfast on a small camp table. The smell was delicious. Cooking eggs and
I reckon I'll prime the tank.
and young, with shaved black hair and a blue dragon tattoo on his temple. Come in. Sit yourself down. At first,
I'm quite lucky it's not sunny outside, or my primer would be fucked.
Imran Gaunt emerged from the rear chamber of the dugout, looking pale and drawn. He was dressed in his uniform trousers and a white singlet with regimental braces strapped tight in place. He gestured Catherine to the seat opposite him at the small camp table and then swung down onto the other stool. Catherine hesitated again, and then sat at the place indicated. Gaunt was a tall, hard man in his 40s, and his lean face utterly matched his name. Trooper Kaffran admired the commissar enormously, and had studied his previous actions at Balhout and formal pride, his service with the Hyrcan 8th, even his majestic command of the disaster that was Tanith. Gaunt seemed more tired than Kaffran had ever seen, but he trusted this man to bring them through. If anyone could redeem the ghosts, it would be Ibram Gaunt. He was a rare beast, a political officer who had been granted full regimental command and the brevet rank of colonel. "I'm sorry to interrupt your breakfast, Commissar," Kaffran said, sitting uneasily at the camp table, fussing with the purse and communiques. "Not at all, Kaffran. In fact, you're just in time to join me." Kaffran hesitated once more, not knowing if this was a joke. "I'm serious," Gaunt said. "You look as hungry as I feel. And I'm sure Bryn has cooked up more than enough for two." As if on cue, the boy produced 2 ceramic plates of food, mashed eggs and grilled ham with tough, toasted chunks of wheat bread. Kaffran looked at the plate in front of him for a moment, as Gaunt tucked into his with relish. "Go on, eat up. It's not every day you get a chance to taste officers' rations," Gaunt said, wolfing down a forkful of eggs. Kaffran nervously picked up his own fork and began to eat. It was the best meal he'd had in 60 days. It reminded him of his days as an apprentice engineer in the wood mills of lost Tanith, back before the founding and the loss of the wholesome suppers served on the long tables of the refectory after last shift. Before long, he was consuming the breakfast with as much gusto as the commissar, who smiled at him appreciatively. The boy Milo then produced a steaming pot of thick caffeine, and it was time to talk business. "So, what do the dispatches tell us this morning?" Gaunt started. "I don't know, sir," Kaffran said, pulling out the communique purse and dropping it onto the tabletop in front of him. "I just carry these things. I never ask what's in them." Gaunt paused for a moment, chewing a mouthful of eggs and ham. He took a long sip of his steaming drink, and then reached out for the purse. Kaffran thought to look away, as Gaunt unsealed the plastic envelope and read the printout strips contained within. "I've been up all night at that thing," Gaunt said, gesturing over his shoulder to the green glow of the tactical communication artificer.
"I am
built into
back.
the money
I've
wall
primed
command.
Morty."
"And it's told me nothing." Gaunt reviewed the dispatches that spilled out of Kaffran's purse. "I bet you and the men are wondering how long we'll be dug into. This is a war of attrition. We could be here for months." Kaffran was by now feeling so warm and satisfied with the good meal he had just eaten that the commissar could have told him his mother had been murdered by orcs, and he wouldn't have worried much. "Sir," Milo's voice was a sudden intruder.
Difficult green, nurgling green.
I think there's an attack coming." Kaffran chuckled.
Tastes like shit down here.
He began. The commissar cut him off. Somehow, Milo sensed each attack so far before the table over.
Ah, nice. My parcel's here. Another 2 seconds, please. Thank you.
Kaffran leaped up in shock. Gaunt was scrabbling for his sidearm, hanging in its holster on a hook by the steps. He grabbed the speech horn of the Foxcaster set, slung under the racks that held his books. "Gaunt to all units! To arms! To arms! Prepare for maximum resistance!" Kaffran didn't wait for any further instruction. He was already up the steps and banging through the gas curtains as volleys of shells assaulted their trenches. Huge plumes of vaporized mud spat up from the trench head behind him, and the narrow gully was full of the yells of suddenly animated guardsmen. A shell whinnied down low across his position and dug a hole the size of a dropship behind the rear breastwork of the trench. Liquid mud drizzled down on him. Kaffran pulled his lasgun from its sling and slithered up towards the top of the trench fire step. There was chaos, panic, troopers hurrying in every direction, screaming and shouting. Was this it? Was this the final moment in the long, drawn-out conflict they had found themselves in? Kaffran tried to slide up the side of the trench far enough to get a sight over the lip, across no man's land to the enemy's emplacements, which they had been locked into for the last 6 months. All he could see was a mist of smoke and mud. There was a crackle of las weapons and several screams. More shells fell. One of them found the center of a nearby communications trench. Then the screaming became real and immediate. The drizzle that fell on him was no longer water and mud. There were body parts in it. Kaffran cursed and wiped the sight lens of his lasgun clean of filth. Behind him, he heard a shout, a powerful voice that echoed along the traverses of the trench and seemed to shake the duckboards. He looked back to see Commissar Gaunt emerging from his dugout. Gaunt was dressed now in his full dress uniform and cap, the camo cloak of his adopted regiment swirling about his shoulders, his face a mask of bellowing rage. In one hand he held his bolt pistol, and in the other his chainsword, which whined and shocked that blew mud up into the air and seemed to separate his spirit from his body. The section of trench had taken a direct hit. Dozens of men were dead. Kafran lay stunned in the broken line of duckboards and splattered mud. A hand grabbed him by the shoulder and hauled him up. Blinking, he looked up to see the face of Gaunt. Gaunt looked at him with a solemn yet inspiring gaze. "Sleeping after a good breakfast?" the commissar inquired of the bewildered trooper. "No, sir, I... The crack of lasguns and needle lasers began to whip around them from the armored loopholes on the trench head. Gaunt wrenched Kafran back to his feet. "I think the time has come," Gaunt said, "and I'd like all of my brave men to be in the line with me when we advance." Spitting out grey mud, Kafran laughed. "I'm with you, sir," he said. "From Tanith to wherever we end up." Kafran heard the whine of Gaunt's chainsword as the commissar leapt up the scaling ladder nailed into the trench wall above the fire step and yelled to his men, "Men of Tanith, do you want to live forever?" Their reply, loud and raucous, was lost in the barrage of shells. But Ibram Gaunt knew what they had said. Weapons blazing, Gaunt's ghosts went over the top and blasted their way towards glory, death, or whatever else awaited them in the smoke. 4. There was a sizzling thicket of lasfire 100 paces deep and 20 kilometers long, where the advancing legions of the enemy met the Imperial Guard regiments head-on. It looked for all the world like squirming nests of colonial insects, bursting forth from their mounds and meeting in a chaotic mess of seething forms, lit by the incessant and incandescent sparking crossfire of their weapons. Lord High Militant General Hector Travier turned away from his tripod-mounted scope. He smoothed the faultless breast of his tunic with well-manicured hands and sighed. "Who would that be dying down there?" he asked in his disturbingly thin, reedy voice. Colonel Flens, field commander of the Jantine Patricians, one of the oldest and most venerated Guard regiments, got off his couch and stood smartly to attention. Flens was a tall, powerful man, the tissue of his left cheek disfigured long ago by a splash of tyrannid bioacid. "General, those ants down there," Riviere gestured idly over his shoulder. "I wondered who they were." Flens strode across the veranda to the chart table, where a flat glass plate was illuminated from beneath with glowing indication runes. He traced a finger across the glass, assessing the 400 kilometers of battlefield front line, representing the focus of the war here in Fortress Binary, a vast, ragged pattern
I'm back.
facing each other across a
Who's missed me?
of cratered mud and shattered factories. "The Western trenches," he began. "They are
It's too warm outside, I tell you.
First Regiment. You know them, sir. Gaunt's mob. What some of the men call..."
I don't even know if half you can hear me. You might be able to.
Riviere wandered across to the ornate refreshment cart and poured himself a tiny cup of rich black...
Hopefully. Where was I? Right.
He sipped, and for a moment...
Green,
sloshed a heavy
green,
fluid between his teeth.
camo.
Flens cringed. Colonel Draker Flens had seen things in his time that would have burned through the souls of most ordinary men. He had watched legions die on the wire. He had seen men eat their comrades in a frenzy of chaos-induced madness. He had seen planets, whole planets, collapse and die and rot. There was something about General Riviere that touched him more deeply and more repugnantly than any of that. It was a pleasure to serve him. Riviere swallowed at last and set aside his cup. "So Gaunt's ghosts get the wake-up call this morning," he said. Hector Riviere was a squat, bullish man in his 60s, balding and yet insistent upon lacquering the few remaining strands of hair across his scalp as if to prove a point. He was fleshy and ruddy, and his uniform seemed to require an entire regimental ration of starch and whitening to prepare each morning. There were medals on his chest which stuck out on a stiff brass pin. He always wore them. Flens was not entirely sure what they all represented. He had never asked. He knew that Revere had seen at least as much as him, and had taken every ounce of glory for it that he could. Sometimes Flens resented the fact that the Lord General always wore his decorations. He supposed it was because the Lord General had them, and he did not. That was what it meant to be a Lord General. The ducal palace on whose veranda they now stood was miraculously intact after 6 months of serial bombardment, and overlooked the wide rift valley of Demos, once the hydroelectric industrial heartland of Fortis Binary, now the axis on which the war
Oh, it's going to need more roof shade.
as far as the eye could see, sprawled the gross architecture of the manufacturing zone. The towers and hangars, the vaults and bunkers, the storage tanks and chimney stacks. A great ziggurat rose to the north, the brilliant gold icon of the Adeptus Mechanicus displayed on its flank. It rivaled, perhaps even surpassed, the temple of the ecclesiarchy, dedicated to the god Emperor. But then, the tech priests of Mars would argue this entire world was a shrine to the god machine incarnate. The ziggurat had been the administrative heart of the tech priests' industry on Fortis, from where they directed a workforce of 19 billion in the production of armor and heavy weaponry for the Imperial war machine. It was a burnt-out shell now. It had been the uprising's first target. In the far hills of the valley, in fortified factories, worker habitats and material store yards, the enemy was dug in. 1 billion strong, a vast, massed legion of demonic cultists. Fortis Binary was a primary Imperial forge world, muscular and energetic in its industrial production. No one knew how the ruinous powers had come to corrupt it, or how a huge section of the massive labor force had been infected with the taint of the fallen gods. But it had happened. 8 months before, almost overnight, the vast manufactory arcs and furnace plants of the Adeptus Mechanicus had been overthrown by the chaos-corrupted workforce, once bonded to serve the machine cult. Only a scarce few of the tech priests had escaped the sudden onslaught and evacuated off-world. Now the massed legions of the Imperial Guard were here to liberate this world, and the action was very much determined by the location. The master factories and tech plants of Fortis Binary were too valuable to be stamped flat by an orbital bombardment. Whatever the cost, for the good of the Imperium, this world had to be retaken, a pace at a time, by men on the ground, fighting men, Imperial Guard, soldiers, who would, by the sweat of their backs, root out and destroy every last scrap of chaos, and leave the precious industries of the Forge world ready and waiting.
Just on my YouTube, I'm trying to remember how I painted Death Guard armor. I need auguring camo as well. There we go. All right, there we go. Shazer, how do I go back to what I was listening to? There we go.
Every few days they try us again, pushing at another line of our trenches, trying to find a leak.
The general looked back at his scope at the carnage 15 kilometers away. Lieutenant First are strong fighters, General, so I have heard. Flens approached Revere and stood with his hands behind his back. The scar tissue of his cheek pinched and twitched slightly, as it often did when he was tense. They have acquitted themselves well on a number of campaigns, and Gaunt is said to be a resourceful leader.
You know him?
The general looked up from his eyepiece, questioningly. Flens paused. I know of him, sir. In the main, by reputation, he said, swallowing many truths. But I have met him in passing. His philosophy of leadership is not in tune with mine.
You don't like him, do you, Flens?
Revere asked pertinently. He could read Flens like a book, and could see some deep resentment lay in the colonel's heart when it came to the subject of the infamous and heroic Commissar Gaunt. He knew what it was. He'd read the reports. He also knew Flens would never actually mention it. Frankly, no, sir. He is a commissar, a political officer. But by a turn of fate, he has achieved a regimental command. War Master Slader granted him the command of the Tanith on his deathbed. I understand the role of commissars in this army, but I despise his officer status. He is sympathetic where he should be inspiring, inspirational where he should be dogmatic. But still in all, he is a commander we can probably trust. Revere smiled. Flens's outburst had been from the heart and honest, but it still diplomatically skirted the real truth.
I trust no other commander than myself, Flens,
The general said flatly.
If I cannot see the victory, I will not trust it to other hands. Your patricians are held in reserve, am I correct?
They are barracked in the work habitats to the west, ready to support a push on either flank.
Go to them, and bring them to readiness,
The Lord General said. He crossed to the chart table again and used a stylus to mark out several long sweeps of light on the glassy top.
We have been held here long enough. I grow impatient. This war should have been over and done months ago. How many brigades have we committed to break the deadlock?
Flens wasn't sure. Revere was famously extravagant with manpower. It was his proud boast that he could choke even the Eye of Terror if he had enough bodies to march into it. Certainly, in the last few weeks, Revere had become increasingly frustrated at the lack of advance. Flens guessed that Revere was anxious to please War Master Makarov, the new overall commander of the Sabbat World's crusade. Revere and Makarov had been rivals for Slado's succession. Having lost to Makarov, Revere probably had a lot to prove, like his loyalty to the new War Master. Flens had also heard rumors that Inquisitor Helday, one of Revere's most trusted associates, had come to Fortis a week before to conduct private talks with the Lord General. Now it was as if Revere yearned to move on, to be somewhere, to achieve something even grander than the conquest of a world, even a world as vital as Fortis Binary. Revere was talking again.
The Shriven
Welcome to
have
the
shown their
live.
hand this morning in greater force than before, and it will take them 8 or 9 hours to withdraw and regroup from whatever advances they make now. Bring your regiments in from the east and cut them off. Use these ghosts as a buffer and slice a hole into the heart of their main defenses. With the will of the beloved Emperor, we may at last break this matter and press a victory.
The Lord General tapped the screen with the point of the stylus as if to emphasize the non-negotiable quality of his instruction. Flens was eager to comply. It was his determined ambition that his regiments should be fundamental in achieving the victory on Fortis Binary. The notion that Gaunt could somehow take that glory from him sickened him, made him think of... He shook off the thought and basked in the idea that Gaunt and his low-born scum would be used, expended, sacrificed on the enemy guns to effect his own
Welcome,
glory.
welcome.
Still, Flens wavered for a second, about to leave. There was no harm in creating a little insurance. He crossed back to the chart table and pointed a leather-gloved patricians will be left vulnerable to both the dug-in forces of the Shriven and to the retreating elements. Gravier mused on this for a moment. Cowardice. What a loaded word for Flens to use in respect to war. Then he clapped his chubby hands together as gleefully as a young child at a birthday party.
Signals officer in here now.
The inner door of the lounge room opened, and a weary soldier hurried in, snapping his worn but clean and polished boots together as he saluted the two officers. Gravier was busy scribing orders onto a message slate. He reviewed them once, and then handed them to the soldier.
We will bring the Vitrian Dragoons in to support the ghosts in the hope that they will drive the Shriven host back into the floodplains. In this way, we should ensure that the fighting is held along the western flank for as long as it takes your patricians to engage the enemy. Signal to this effect, and signal also the Tanith commander, Gaunt. Instruct him to push on. His duty today is not merely to repel, it is to press on and use this opportunity to take the Shriven frontline trenches. Ensure that this instruction is clearly an order directly from me. There will be no faltering, tell him. No retreat. They will achieve, or they will die.
Flens allowed himself an inward smile of triumph. His own
Welcome to
back
the
was
stream,
now
whoever's
comfortably
watching.
covered, and Gaunt had been forced into a push that would have him dead by nightfall. The soldier saluted again and made to exit.
One last thing,
Gravier said. The soldier skidded to a halt and turned nervously. Gravier tapped the samovar with a chunky signet ring.
ask them to send in some fresh caffeine. This is stale.
The soldier nodded and exited. From the clunk of the ring, it was clear that the big gilt vessel was still nearly full. A regiment could drink for several days on what the general clearly intended to throw away. He managed to wait until he was out of the double doors before he spat a silent curse at the man who was orchestrating this bloodbath. Flens saluted too and walked towards the door. He picked up his peaked cap from the sideboard and carefully set it upon his head, the back of the brim first. "Praise the Emperor, Lord General," he said.
What? Oh, yes, indeed.
Gravier said absently as he sat back on his chaise and lit a cigar. 5. Major Rawn threw himself flat into a foxhole and almost drowned in the milky water which had accumulated in its depths. Spluttering, he pulled himself up to the lip of the crater and took aim with his lasgun. The air all around was thick with smoke, and the flashing streams of gunpowder.
Welcome to the live.
Before
How
he
you
went
all
out
doing?
of fire, several more bodies crashed into the makeshift cover by his side. Trooper Neff and the platoon adjutant, Fagor. Beside them, troopers Caffran, Val, and Lonigan. There was Trooper Clay as well, but he was dead. The fierce crossfire had cauterized his face before he could reach cover. None of them looked twice at Clay's body in the water behind them. They had seen that sort of thing 1,000 times too often. Rawn used his scope to check over the rim of the foxhole. Somewhere out there, the Shriven were using some heavy weapon to support their infantry. The thick and explosive fire was cutting a wedge out of the ghosts as they advanced. Neff was fiddling with his weapon, and Rawn glanced down at him. "What's the matter, trooper?" he asked. "There's mud in my firing mechanism, son. I can't free it." Fagor snatched the lasgun from the younger man, ejected the magazine, and slung back the oiled cover of the ignition chamber so that it was open, with the focus rings exposed. Fagor spat into the open chamber and then slammed it shut with a clack. Then he shook it vigorously and jammed the energy magazine back into its slot. Neff watched as Fagor swung round again and lifted the gun above his head, firing it wholesale into the smoke beyond the foxhole. Fagor tossed the weapon back to the trooper. "See, that's working now." Neff clutched the returned weapon and wiggled up to the lip of the hole. "We'll be dead before we go another meter," Lonigan said from below them. "For feck's sake," Trooper Val spat. "We'll just get 'em ducking again." He unhooked a clutch of grenades from his webbing and tossed them out to the other soldiers, sharing them like a schoolboy shares stolen fruit. A click of the thumb primed each weapon, and Rawn smiled to his men as he prepared to heave his into the air. "Val's assessment is correct," Rawn said. "Let's blind them." They hefted the bombs into the sky. They were frag grenades, designed to deafen, blind, and pepper those in range with needles of shrapnel. There was the multiple crump of detonation. That That's got them ducking at least, Catherine said, then realized that the others were already scrambling up out of the foxhole to charge. He followed quickly. Screamed. The ghost charged over a short stretch of green ooze, then slithered down into a revetment, screened from them by the smoke. The blackened impacts of the grenades were all around them, as were the twisted bodies of several of their dead foe. Rawn slammed onto his feet at the bottom of the slide and looked around. For the first time in 6 months on Fortis Binary, he saw the enemy face to face. The Shriven, the ground forces of the enemy he had been sent here to fight. They were surprisingly human, but twisted and malformed. They wore combat armor, cleverly adapted from the work suits they had used in the forges of the planet, the protective masks and gauntlets actually woven into their wasted, pallid flesh. Rawn tried not to linger on the dead. It made him think too much about those legions he had still to kill. In the smoke, he found 2 more of the Shriven, crippled by the grenade blasts. He finished them quickly. He found Catherine close behind him. The young trooper was shocked by what he saw. They have lasguns, Catherine said, aghast, and body armor. Beside him, Neff turned one of the corpses over with his toe. And look, they have grenades and munitions. Neff and Catherine looked at the Major. Rawn shrugged. So they're tough bastards. What did you expect? They've held the Imperium off for 6 months. Lonigan, Val, and Fagor hurried along to join them. Rawn waved them along, further into the enemy dugout. The space widened in front of them, and they saw the metal-beamed stone barns of an industrial silo. Rawn quickly gestured them into cover. Almost at once, lasfire started to sear down the trench towards them. Val was hit, and his shoulder vanished in a puff of red mist. He went down hard on his backside, and then flopped over, clutching with the one arm that would still work. The pain was so momentous, he couldn't even scream. Theth, spat Rawn. See to him, Neff. Neff was the squad medic. He pulled open his thigh pouch of field dressings as Fagor and Catherine tried to drag the whimpering Val into cover. Gleaming lines of lasfire stitched the trench line and tried to pin them all. Neff quickly bound Val's ghastly injury. We'll have to get him back, son, he shouted down the grey channel to Rawn. Rawn was pushing himself into the cover of the defile, the grey ooze matting his hair as the las bursts burned the air around him. Not now, he said. 6. Ibram Gaunt leapt down into the trench and broke the neck of the first Shriven he met with his descending boots. The chainsaw screamed in his fist, and as he reached the duck boards of the enemy emplacement, he swung it left and right to cut 2 more apart in drizzles of blood, putting a bullet into his upturned chin as he flailed backwards. Milo shivered. This backwards. Milo shivered. This was the horror of war that he had always dreamt of, yet never wished to see. Passionate men caught against each other in a dugout hole 3 meters wide and 6 deep. The Shriven were monsters, almost elephantine, with the long, nozzled gas masks sewn into the flesh of their faces. Their body armor was a dull industrial green and rubberized. They had taken the protective garb of their workspace and made it their battle dress, daubing everything with eye-aching symbols. Slammed against the trench wall by a falling body, Milo looked down at the corpses which gathered around them. He saw, for the first time, in detail, the nature of his foe. The twisted, corrupted human forms of the Chaos host, incised with twisted runes and sigils painted on the dull green rubber of their armor, or carved into their raw flesh. One of the Shriven ploughed in past Gaunt's shrieking
so you know how, so I think the best way I could put it is, I want it to be like translucent almost. I want it to be like, I think the best way I can put it is moth wings, like Mothma. So it's like translucent blue, translucent purple. It'll make more sense when I start painting it, but like the Morty is going to be pretty bog standard. Well, not bog standard. It's going to be like obviously grimdark. But then you look at the wings, and once you see the wings, they catch your eye, and you think that's a bloody good model.
fountain of mud and other unnameable things were blown into fragments. He often missed what he was aiming at, but under these conditions, that wasn't an option.
My only issue is I'm going to sit and wait for these to dry now.
Enemy. He began to laugh, coated with the rain of blood that he was loosing with his shrieking chainsaw. Every now and then, he would fire his pistol and explode another of the Shriven. He was filled with fury. The signal from Lord General Drevere had been draconian and cruel. Gaunt would have wanted to take the enemy trenches if he could, but to be ordered to do so with no other option except death was, in his opinion, the decision of a flawed, brutal mind. He'd never liked Drevere, not at any time since their first meeting.
Any other questions?
When Drevere had still been an ambitious armor colonel, back on Derendara, back with Oktar and the higher camps. Gaunt had kept the nature of the orders from his men. Unlike Drevere, he understood the mechanisms of morale and inspiration. Now they were taking the damned trenches, almost in spite of Drevere's orders rather than because of them. His laughter was the laughter of fury and resentment, and
Do I
pride
have
in
a
his
handle
men
for Morty?
regardless. Nearby, Milo stumbled to his feet, holding the lasgun. We're there, Gaunt thought. We've broken them. 10 meters down the line, Sergeant Blaine leapt in with his platoon and sealed the event, blasting left and right with his lasgun as his men charged, bayonets first. There was a frenzy of lasfire and a flash of silver-tanned blades. Milo was still holding the lasgun when Gaunt snatched it from him and threw it down onto the duckboards. Do you think you're a soldier, boy?
Yes, sir.
Really? You know I am. Gaunt looked down at the 16-year-old
Oh,
boy
shows
and
it.
smiled sadly. Maybe you are. But for now, play up. Play a tune that
On
will sing us
site.
to glory. Milo pulled his tennis pipe from his pack and breathed.
No, that's
For a moment,
I'm
it
washing
seemed like a man.
with Agrax again. It dark. So with the video I have up,
An old tune
it
that had always
darkens.
inspired the men in the taverns of
It
Paris.
darkens the armor quite nicely,
Make merry.
and then
Sergeant Blaine heard the tune.
spot some
Laid into the enemy.
nurgle in green and some green camo on,
Started to sing along.
and then in the shadows I put Anthonian
Trooper Bragg
back on.
chuckled and loaded another rocket into the huge launcher that he carried. A moment later,
That's only
another
because
section
I have
trench
a
dissolved
recipe
in a
for
deadly fire.
dark Death Guard armor.
Trooper Capran heard the music, a distant plaintive wail across the
It's a brand new notebook.
It cheered him for a moment as he moved with the men under Major Rawn's direction up over the bodies of the Shriven, side by side with Neff, Monaghan, Larkin, and the rest. Even now, poor Val was being stretchered back to their lines, screaming as the drugs wore off. That was the moment the bombardment started. Kafran found himself flying, lifted by a wall of air issued from a bomb blast that created a crater 12 meters wide. A huge slew of mud was thrown up in the sky with him. He landed hard, broken, and his mind frayed. He lay for a while in the mud, strangely peaceful. As far as he knew, Neff, Major Rawn, Fagor, Larkin, Lonigan, all of us were dead and vaporized.
Actually, I have
As shells continued,
I have 2 more bottles of
Kafran
Agrax.
sank his head into the slime and silently begged for release.
That's just a little one. I have
A long way off,
two big
Lord
bottles.
High Militant General Drevere
Though I would not say no to 1 extra bottle.
their onslaught. He realized that it would not be today after all. Sighing angrily, he poured himself another cup from the freshly refilled samovar. 7. Colonel Corbeck had 3 platoons with him and moved them forward into the traversed network of the enemy trenches. The bombardment had been howling over their heads for 2 hours now, obliterating the front edge of the Shriven emplacements.
To be fair, paint's just surprised me, man. I've got
Who had not made it into the comparative
got a
cover
massive
that
paint
enemy
rack. I'll show you later.
The tunnels and channels they moved through were empty and abandoned. Clearly, the Shriven had pulled out as the bombardment began. The trenches were well made and engineered, but at every turn or bend there was a blasphemous shrine to the dark powers that the enemy worshipped. Corbeck had Trooper Spillane turn his flamer on each shrine they found and burn it away before any of his men could fully appreciate the grim nature of the offerings laid before it. By Corral's estimation, after consulting the tightly scrolled fiber-like charts, they
So,
were advancing into
oh well.
support trenches behind the Shriven main line. Corbeck felt cut off,
Is that Benny?
not just by the savage bombardment that shook their very bones every other second.
Oh no, I don't have a list, dude. It's just
No shell would fall short.
whatever you want to donate, you know?
But more, he felt cut off from the rest of
I just like paints.
The electromagnetic aftershock, the ceaseless barrage, was scrambling their communications. Both the microbead intercoms.
Yeah, that's Benny. Hey up, Benny. Where is it, Bruce?
Long-range Voxcaster radio set.
Where is it, Hunter?
No orders were getting through. No urgings to regroup, to rendezvous with other units, to press forward for an objective, or even to retreat. In such circumstances, the rulebook of Imperial Guard warfare was clear. If in doubt, move forward. Korbeck sent scouts ahead, men he knew were fast and able. Baru, Colmar, and Scout Sergeant McCall. They pulled their Tanith stealth cloaks around them and slipped away into the dusty darkness. Walls of smoke and powder were drifting back over the trench lines, and visibility was dropping. Sergeant Blaine gestured silently.
What do you mean, wow, so.
That were descending. Korbeck
Yeah.
knew his intent.
My painting is so.
Voice it for fear of spooking the unit. The Shriven had no qualms about the use of poison agents, foul airborne gases that would boil the blood and fester the lungs. Korbeck pulled out a whistle and blew 3 short blasts. The men behind him put guns at ease and pulled respirators from their webbing. Colonel Korbeck buckled his own respirator mask around his face. He hated the loss of visibility, the claustrophobia of the thick-lensed gas hoods, the shortness of breath that the tight rubber mouthpiece provoked. But poison clouds were not the half of it. The sea of mud that the bombardment was agitating and casting up into the wind as vapor droplets was full of other venoms. The airborne spores of disease incubated in the decaying bodies out there in the dead zone. Typhus, gangrene, livestock anthrax bred in the corrupting husks of pack animals and cavalry steeds, and the vicious mycotoxins that hungrily devoured all organic matter, transforming it into a black, insidious mold. As first officer to the Tanith First, Korbeck had been privy to the dispatches circulated from the General Staff. He knew that nearly 80% of the fatalities amongst the Imperial Guards since the invasion began had been down to gas, disease, and secondary infection. A shriven soldier could face you point blank with a charged lasgun, and still your chances of survival would be better than if you took a stroll in no man's land. Muffled and blinkered by the mask, Korbeck edged his unit on. They reached a bifurcation in the support trenches, and Korbeck called up Sergeant Grell, officer of the 5th Platoon, instructing him to take 3 fire teams to the left and cleanse whatever they found. The men moved on.
Welcome to the live. How do you all do?
Nothing had come back from the scouts. He was moving as blind as he had been before he sent them out. Advancing now at double time, the colonel led his remaining 100 or so men along a wide communications trench. 2 of his sharper-eyed vanguard moved in front, using magnetically sensitive wands attached to heavy backpacks to sweep for explosives and booby traps. It seemed that the Shriven had pulled back too rapidly to leave any surprises, but every few meters the column stopped as one of the sweepers found something odd. A tin cup, a piece of armor, a canteen tray. Sometimes it was a strange idol made of smelt ore from the forge furnaces that the corrupted workers had carved into some bestial form. Korbeck personally put his las pistol to each one and blew it into fragments. The 3rd time he did this, the wretched thing he was destroying blew up in sharp fragments as his round tore it open along some fault. Trooper Drail, cowering.
Next army or next Death Guard miniature?
He winced and sat back in the mud, hard. Sergeant Corral called up the medic, who put on a field dressing. Korbeck
Personally,
he was so anxious
I've never actually painted for myself.
he had heard one of his own.
It's always been, I've painted stuff.
Drail said through his gas.
It's always been, I'll have painted stuff and
Voltus Watergate, I took
and
a
obviously
bayonet in the thigh.
give it to someone.
I'm back home on Tanith, he got
Sell
a
it.
bottle end in his cheek at a bar fight. Laughed.
For myself, that is a tough
Is that
question.
The men around them laughed, ugly, sucking sounds through their respirators.
Let me have a thing.
Drail was a handsome, popular soldier whose songs and good humour kept his platoon in decent spirits. Korbeck also knew
Like, can this be anything kind of thing? Like,
my mistake, Drail, Korbeck said. I owe you a drink. At the very least, Colonel, Drail said. Deftly armed his lasgun to show he was ready to continue. 8. They They moved on.
Oh,
They reached
I'll
a
have to
section
stop
of the trench
painting in it
where
for a
monumental
second and
shells
have a
formed
proper
shore
think.
and blown the thin cavity open in a huge crater wound, nearly 30
If I could have anything
Already,
Warhammer
brackish
related,
ground
what
water
would
was
I
welling
have?
up in its bowl. With only the sweepers ahead of him, Corbeck waded in first to lead them across into the cover where the trench recommenced. The water came up to his mid-thigh.
I did not say Thunderhawk.
He could feel it burning his flesh as he
Just because you want a
walked
Thunderhawk.
his teeth. There was a faint swirl of mist around the cloth of his uniform as the fabric burned. He ordered the men behind him back and scrambled up on the far side to join the sweepers.
I don't know. I think I have everything I want at the minute. I mean, I'm excited to get some Eldar.
Corbeck felt lesions forming on his thighs and shins.
Like, obviously, I've never actually painted Eldar before.
Across the crater. Move the men up and round, he cried, and bring the medic over in the first party. Afraid by the exposure of moving around the lip of the crater against the sky, the men traversed quickly and timidly. Corbeck had Corell regroup them on the far side in fire team lines along each side of the trench. The medic came to him and the sweepers and sprayed their legs with antiseptic mist from the flask. The pain eased, and the fabric was damped, but no longer smoldered. Corbeck was picking up his gun when Sergeant Grell
I'm just messing about the laptop for a second.
and saw what Grell had found.
But yeah,
It was Colmar, one of the
I
scouts he had
also
sent
want some towel. Don't forget.
hanging pendulously from the trench wall on a great rusty iron spike which impaled his chest. It was the sort of spike that the workers in the forge world would have used to wedge and manipulate the hoppers of molten ore in the Adeptus Mechanicus furnace works. His hands and feet were missing.
I mean, Space Marines are never a bad shot. I like Space Marines.
Though they had met no
Got
serious
lots.
resistance, it was sickening
Lots of normal
that they weren't alone in these trenches.
infantry.
Whatever the number of the shriven still here, be it stragglers left behind or
I like kill teams.
set to thwart them. A malicious presence was shadowing
I think I've
the
got
gullies and channels of
2 Death Corps Kree kill teams.
Corbeck took hold of the spike and pulled Colmar
Two of the new sister ones, 2 of the new Corn ones,
corpse in it, so that no one would see it,
a Space Marine kill team for myself, which I've made.
as he had done with the Sirens.
The sisters ones I made myself.
Grell led the men forward behind the sweepers. Corbeck
What
suddenly
else?
stopped dead, as if an insect had stung him. There was a rasping in his ear. He realized it was his
Yeah,
mother.
I think that's all my kill teams.
He
No,
registered an overwhelming sense of
I have 2 commanders as well.
live at all, even as he realized it was a short-range broadcast from McCall, sergeant of the scouting unit. Can you hear it, sir? Came McCall's voice. Seth, hear what? Corbeck asked. All he could hear was the ceaseless thunder of the enemy guns and the
But yeah, that's it really.
9. Bryn Milo heard the drums before Gaunt did. Gaunt valued his musicians' almost preternaturally sharp senses, but they sometimes disturbed him nonetheless. The insight reminded him of someone. The girl, perhaps, years ago. The one with the
I need to
sight,
paint them first.
the one who had haunted his dreams for so many years afterwards. Drums, the boy hissed, and a moment later, Gaunt caught the sound too. They were moving through the silos and shelled-out structures of the rising industrial manufacturers just behind the shriven lines. Sooty shells of melted stone, rusted metal girderwork, and fractured ceramite. Gargoyles, built to protect the buildings against contamination, had been defaced or toppled completely. Gaunt was exceptionally cautious. The action of the day had played out unexpectedly. They had advanced far further than he had anticipated from the starting point of a simple repulse of an enemy attack, thanks both to good fortune and Revere's harsh directive. Reaching the front of the enemy lines, they had found them generally abandoned after the initial
What?
fighting.
Want the freezer?
Majority of the
Yeah.
men had
Yeah.
Who are you talking to?
No
Now,
one.
the
Who's that
third
talking to?
enemy
That's my laptop.
cut off their lines of retreat. Gaunt felt that the Shriven had made a great mistake and pulled back too far in their urgency to avoid a guard attack.
Well, what are you having for tea?
Answered,
What?
I said, what are you having for tea?
I don't know. We haven't got no.
Yeah.
Gaunt didn't like that. 230 men were in the
See that?
but he knew that if the Shriven
Oh, that's cold.
might as well be on the guard. As they
Yeah, you can
progressed,
empty this shit occasionally.
black and factory manufacturers
I don't know I need emptying. I've been sat down here since 2.
Machinery had been stripped down. There was nothing whole left here, apart from the chaos shrines, which the Shriven had erected at regular intervals. Like Colonel Corbeck, the Commissar had a flamer brought up to expunge any trace of the outbreaks. However, ironically, he was moving in exactly the opposite direction on the trench lines.
Yeah, no, I'd probably do kill teams first. Depends what I'm inspired for.
For wandering blind and undirected through what was by any estimation enemy territory. The sound of the drums rolled in. Gaunt pulled up his Voxcast operator, Trooper Redman, and tersely barked into the speech hall of the heavy backpack set, demanding to know if there was anyone out there. The drums rolled. There was a return across the radio link, an incomprehensible swarm of garbled words. At first, Gaunt thought the transmission was scrambled, but then he realized that it was another language. He repeated his demand, and after a long, painful silence, the coherent
I'd say I wonder why Joe's not here. No, Joe's always on
This is Colonel
World of
Zoran
Warcraft.
of the Veteran Dragoons. We are moving in to support you. Hold your
bittersweet almost.
Gaunt acknowledged, and then spread his men across the silo concourse and cover, watching and waiting. Ahead of them, something flashed in the dull light, and then Gaunt saw soldiers moving down towards them. They didn't see the ghosts until the very last minute. With their tenacious ability to hide in anything, and their obscuring cloaks, Gaunt's ghosts were masters of
Ooh.
stealth camouflage.
A Gaunt's Ghosts army. That is my dream. Like full on, there's every single character named in the audiobooks. Then there's like custom Tanith troopers. I think that'd be pretty cool.
Since he joined the First and Only and moved out of concealment, signaling them openly as he rose to his feet from cover. He advanced to meet the commanding officer. Close to, the Vitrians were impressive soldiers. Their unusual body armor was made from a toothed metallic mail, which covered them in form-fitting sections. It glinted like obsidian. Their helmets were full face and grim with narrow eye slits, glazed with dark glass. Their
Like that would be cool. Or
Commissar Gaunt of the Tanith First and Only.
oh, what is it called?
Saluted the greeting. Zoran of the Vitrian.
There's a faction of Space Marines,
Good to see that there are some of you left out here.
and they're like
You are being called in to support the regiment already
they're like
slaughtered.
almost, I think they're dead Space Marines, but they come through like the warp or
Zoran
something,
pulled back the visor of his helmet to reveal a handsome
and they're all
dark-skinned
like fire
He
and
caught Gaunt with a quizzical
like they're
stare.
pretty cool.
They are not. We were just wondering what in the name of the Emperor it was ourselves.
What sounds like a series for me?
Gaunt looked away at the smoke and the fractured buildings around them. The noise had grown. Now, it sounded like hundreds of drums. Thousands from all around. For each drum, a drummer. They were surrounded and completely outnumbered. 10. Kafran dragged himself across the mud and slid into a crater. Around him, the bombardment.
So, Legion of the Damned, that's it. That's a good one.
And most of his kit, but he still had his silver knife.
We'll take the
Pistol that had come his way as a trophy at some time or other. Wriggling to the lip of the crater, he caught sight of figures far away. Soldiers who seemed to be dressed in glass. There was a full unit of them, caught in the crossfire of the serial bombardment. They were being slaughtered. Shells fell close again, and Kafran slid down to cover his head with his arms. This was hell, and there was no way out of it. Curse this,
true,
in the name of theft.
but I'd have to use a lot of YouTube tutorials for that one.
Something fell into the shell hole next to him. It was one of the glass-clad soldiers he had seen from a distance, presumably one who had fled in search of cover. The man held up his hands to avoid Kafran's potential wrath. God, I'm God, like you, the man said hastily.
Any armies I hate,
Dark face helmet to reveal an attractive
oh dear.
skin that was almost as dark
Are we
as
talking
polished ebony.
how they look, or are we talking you just don't like him whatsoever?
Trooper Kafran said humorously.
Centaurius. You'll have to send me a picture of that one.
And was aware of the way the man in the articulated metallic armor regarded the blue dragon tattoo over his right eye with disdain. Trooper Kafran,
Talith fast.
In general,
After a moment, the Vitrian shook his head. A shell fell close and showered them in mud.
that's
Getting up
a
to their
tough
knees,
one.
They turned and looked out at the apocalypse.
Can I say one for Sigma,
Well, friend,
one for 40k?
I think we're here for the duration. 11.
Right, for
To the
40k,
west, the Jantine patricians.
I might have to say
Colonel Flens.
Gene
They
Stealer
rode on
Cults.
Chimera personnel carriers that lurched and reeled across the slick and miry landscape. The patricians were noble soldiers.
And then
Purple uniforms.
for Age of Sigma,
Flens had been honoured when, 6 years before, he had become their commanding officer,
I don't know, because Sylvaneth have some cool models.
and had won for him a great deal of praise. They had a regimental history.
I don't want to say Stormcast, because everyone bashes Stormcast, but they're actually they've got some really lovely models, especially Yandrasta's Celestial Spear. So I might have to say Slaves to Darkness.
Just the one. And it nagged at Flens day and night. He would rectify that, here on Fortis Binary. He took his scope and looked at the battlefield ahead.
Yeah,
He had 2 columns of vehicles with
It's
upwards
a
of 10,000 men.
hot
sitting
hot
in
take, I'd
to
say.
the flank of the Shriven, as the Tanith and the Vitrians drove them back. Both those regiments were fully deployed into the Shriven lines.
Yeah,
Flens had
Chaos.
encountered this bombardment.
Not a fan of Sigma Chaos, to be fair with you.
2 kilometers ahead, the ground was volcanic, with the pounding of the macro
Right, now
shells.
you're distracting me.
Mud fogged back to splatter their
Oh dear.
There was no way of going round, and Flens didn't even wish to consider the chances of driving his column through to the narrow. Lord General Revere believed in acceptable losses, and had demonstrated this practicality on a fair few number of occasions without compunction. But Flens wasn't about to commit suicide. His scar,
Why is he not going to commit suicide? That sounds
for
fun.
all his manoeuvring with Revere,
I'm joking.
this wasn't the way it was meant
Don't
to
do
go.
that.
He had been cheated of his victory. Pull back, he ordered into the box handset, and felt the gears of his vehicle.
No, don't
grind
close.
reverse as the
Need the
carrier
paint pot open. Come
His
on.
second officer, a big, older man called Rockers, glared at him.
Fucking
with a
hate
bristle
Citadel paint pots.
We are to pull out, Colonel, he asked, as if obliteration by artillery shell was something he craved. Shut up, spat Flens, and repeated the order into the boxcaster. What about Gaunt? Rockers asked. What do you think? Flens sneered, gesturing out of the Chimera's vision slit at the inferno that raged along the deadland. We may not get glory today, but at least we can content ourselves in the knowledge that that bastard is dead. Rockets nodded, and a slow smile of consolation spread across his face.
We'll have to go over this one again. This
None
is
of the
just a
veterans
quick
had
quote.
forgotten Kev 1173. The patrician armored convoy snaked back on itself and thundered home.
I don't know any
across the
Death
lines
Guard
before the
green
Shriven
primer
emplacements
either,
arranged them.
which is fine.
Victory would have to wait a while longer. The Tanith first and only, and the Vitrian support regiments were on their own. If there were indeed any of them left alive. A memory. Giletus Decimus, 18 years earlier. Oktar died slowly. It took 8 days. The commander had once joked, on Darandara, or was it Phobia? Gaunt forgot. But he remembered the joke. It won't be war that slays me.
Yeah, the amount,
These damn victory
I've spilled a bunch
celebrations.
of Agrax
They had
before,
been in a smoke-filled
and Reichland,
surrounded by cheering
Ah,
citizens.
and I've even spilt all over a white bed
Sergeant Gers,
Poxwalker flesh.
climbed the statue of the 2-headed imperial eagle in the courtyard to string the Hurricane colours from the crest. The streets were full of bellowing crowds.
Yeah, and don't ever spill Poxwalker flesh on a bed. I don't recommend it.
Phobia. Definitely phobia. Cadet Gaunt.
It'll look like you've had something weird come out your knob.
But Oktar had a way of being right all the time. And he had been right about this. The instrumentality of the Giletus world flock had been delivered from the savage orc threat after 10
I was gonna say, if you post that, I mean,
Oktar
by the time to spray your rives, it might already be painted. Now, if you've got more vehicles for me, if they're built, build whatever you want. Obviously, painting up, build it up. I hate building Warhammer. I can't stand it half the time.
Through Elgaz's exploding skull.
I say that, and I've got God knows how much
The victory parades, the host of jubilant citizens.
No, that was not spilt paint. That was exploded
The
paint.
medal ceremony,
That's a difference.
the drinking, the
That was Green Stuff World, right?
canning.
And I thought, oh, shake it
As if
up.
realizing
Looks
their
alright.
untenable
Squirt it out. No.
the orcs had
All
taken
over my dressing down. All over my bed.
days of their occupation.
And I need to buy a new dressing
Taster
down.
servitors had sniffed most of it out, but that one stray bottle. Adjutant Broth had found the rack of antique wines on the second night of the Liberation festivities, hidden in a long box in the palace rooms, which Oktar had commandeered as a playground for his officer Carter. No one had even thought. 8 were dead, including Broth, by the time anyone realized. Dead in seconds, collapsed in convulsive racks, frothing and gurgling. Oktar had only just sipped from his glass when someone sounded the alarm. One sip. That, and Oktar's iron constitution, kept him alive for 8 days. Gaunt had been off in the barracks behind the Hive Central Palace, settling a drunken brawl, when Tannhaus summoned him. Nothing could be done. By the 8th day, Oktar was a skeletal husk in his old, robust self. The medics emerged from his chamber, shaking hopeless heads. The smell of decay and corruption was almost overpowering.
The smell of decay and corruption, bloody hell.
Some of the men, some of the toughest Hayakans he had come to know, were weeping openly. "He wants the boy," one of the doctors said as he came.
Oh no.
Gaunt entered the wall.
It's funny because the metal ball wasn't stuck in the tip either. It was rattling about.
By glowing fire lamps and burning bowls of incense, Oktar was plainly minutes from death. "Imran." The voice was like a whisper, a thing of no substance. Smoke. "Commissar General, it is past time for this. Well past time. I should never.
I'm trying to think of how to, what to do while I wait for the agrax to dry.
Waiting. Truth of it is, I couldn't bear to lose you. Not you, Imran. Far too good a soldier to hand the way to the ladder of promotion. Who are you? Gordon shrugged. The stench was gagging his throat. Cadet Imran Gaunt. No. From now, you are Commissar Imran Gaunt, appointed in the extremis of the field to the commissarial office, to watch over the Hayakan regiments. Fetch a clock. We must record my authority in this matter, and your oath. Oktar willed himself to live for 17 minutes more, as an administratum clerk was found, and the proper oath ceremony observed. He died clutching Commissar Gaunt's hands in his bony, sweat-oiled claws. Ibram Gaunt was stunned. Empty.
Yeah, but like, I should, you, in theory, we've brought a product, right? There should be quality control. We should not have to do that.
Even noticed the soldiers saluting.
Like, we should not have to put stuff down a tip to make sure it's fine and...
One. It wasn't the drums that Korbeck really detested. It was the rhythm. There was no sense to it. Though the notes were a regular drum sound, the beats came sporadically like a fluctuating harp, overlapping and syncopating. The bombardment was still ever present, but now, as they closed on the source of the beating, the drumming overrode even the roar of the explosions beyond the front trenches. Korbeck knew his men were spooked, even before Sergeant Corral said it. Down the channel ahead, Scout Sergeant McCall was returning towards them. He had missed the signal to put on his respirator, and his face was pinched, tinged with green. As soon as he saw the masked men of his company, he anxiously pulled on his own gas hood. "Report," Korbeck demanded quickly. "It opens up ahead," McCall said through his mask, breathing hard. "There are wide manufacturing areas ahead of us. We've broken right through their lines into the heart of this section of the industrial belt.
This will just be a case of putting more paint on until it's semi-solid colour.
Well, thousands of them out there. They're bound to attack soon. But what are they waiting for?" Korbeck nodded and moved forward, ushering his men on behind him. They hugged the walls of the trench and assumed fire pattern formation, crouching low and aiming in a sweep above the head of the man in front. The trench opened out from its zigzag into a wide, stone-walled basin, which overlooked a slope leading down into colossal factory sheds. The thump of the drums, The incessant and irregular beat was now all pervading.
I won't be doing Typhus. Not. I won't be doing Morty anytime soon.
Grail taking the right and Lucas taking the left. He led the front front himself.
It'll be one of the last
The
ones I
slope
do.
was steep and watery slate. By necessity, they became more concerned with keeping upright and descending than with raising their weapons defensively. The concourse around the sheds was open and empty. Feeling exposed, Corbeck beckoned his men on, the front prong of the attack spearheading out into a wide phalanx, as men slipped down the slope.
That's going to need to dry for 5 minutes.
Now established at his right, and soon Lucas's was also in position. The drums now throbbed so loudly they vibrated the
So,
respirator.
Question for you, Mike.
Thudded against their chest wall.
Poxwalkers. Any tips on them? I've never painted lots of Poxwalkers before.
Sergeant Grell moved another dozen in behind them as Corbeck reached the first of the sheds. He looked back and saw the men were keeping the line well, although he was concerned to see Drayle lift his respirator for a moment to wipe his face with the back of his cuff. He knew the man was ill at ease following that
No.
injury.
Because I brought it through Element Games, they said,
Put that feffing
"Oh,
mask in place."
we're not doing nothing about it."
Then, with 7 las guns covering the angles, he entered the shed. The gabled building.
Wow, you lucky bastard.
Corbeck could scarcely
I think the only turbo door paint I have is the 4D, and that was specifically for my Sisters of Battle kill team. And I've used about half a bottle just on the bases.
Didn't even want to think where that skin had come from. All that he was aware of was the syncopated and irregular thudding of the drum machines and the shriven that left him.
You're big models to go. Oh no, Morty's for last because he's the centerpiece.
And he was too safe to understand. A further
You know, save the best for last.
and scouting further, they realized all of the sheds were filled with the makeshift drum machines. 10,000 drums, 20,000 of every size and shape, beating
Contrast paints for the. Yeah, I can see that.
The whole and assumed close defensive fire. But Corbeck knew they were all scared.
But I want to put effort in,
Were more than most.
like lots of effort.
He called up Spillane, his heavy flamer stinking of oil and dripping petroleum. He pointed to the first of the sheds. Sergeant Grell will block you with a fire team, he told the flamethrower. You don't have to watch your back. Just burn each of these hellholes in turn. Spillane nodded, paused to tighten a gasket on his fire-blackened weapon.
But I want to do like
He moved forward to the first
with the Poxwalkers. I want to do them like mixes of.
Spillane raised his flame.
Some of them's got big, like purpley flesh, pinky flesh,
There was a beat.
like a blue diseased kind of flesh.
All of the eccentric
Obviously, you get your couple that like
struck.
green.
Spillane's head exploded. He dropped like a sack of vegetables onto the ground. The impact of his body and the spasm of his nervous system clenching the trigger on his flamer.
Right, how are you
Spike of his
wanting?
flame
Yes,
stabbed
nice
around
colour.
in an unforgiving arc,
But how are you wanting your bases
across
done?
and then whipping back to incinerator.
Because simple bases, obviously, no extra charge there. But
Panic.
if you want real, like I don't know, more detail on each base, I'd have to like
Somehow, at the point of
obviously
death,
add the
Spillane's
cost
finger had locked
of the extra basing stuff on.
weapon, slack on its
Well, I'm not amazing at bases myself.
back and forth like a fire-breathing serpent. 2 more soldiers were caught in its breath. 3 more.
Well, if you want to like pools of ooze and
Corbeck
whatnot.
threw himself flat against the side wall of the shed as the flames ripped past him. His mind raced, and thoughts formed slower than actions.
new slapshot,
The
yeah.
grenade was in his hand, armed with a flick of his thumb. He leapt from cover and screamed to any who could hear him to get down, even as he flung the grenade at Spillane's corpse and the twisting flamer. The explosion was catastrophic, igniting the tanks on the back of the corpse. Fire, white hot.
But do you slap
vomited
chop
from the door of the
with
shed,
a grey,
front of the roof out.
or do
Sections
you
of splintered stone collapsed down
put the
across
colour
ceiling.
you've contrasted but slightly brighter?
Corbeck, like many others, was knocked flat by the hot shock.
So if you were to do Drakenhof Nightshade,
Ditch nearby, Scout Sergeant
for example, would you put like a really
he had noticed something
bright blue and just gently put that on top.
Now irregular and unformed again. It was so difficult to concentrate.
But yeah, obviously I want to do the Poxwalkers random.
Skillane had been hit from behind
Yeah, yeah.
with a last blast to the head. Cradling his own rifle, he scrambled
I
around
just
to
wish
find
more
the
people were
source of
talking.
attack.
It's
A sniper,
like it's nice talking to you, but more people need to talk, man. Like they'll poke their head in, then they'll leave, then they poke their head back in, and then they'll leave again.
A smile on his face. Trail!
Whoop.
Scrambling up from the trench. Trail turned to face him across the concourse with a milky nothingness in his eyes. He raised his gun and fired. McCall threw himself flat, but the first shot seared down the length of his back and broke his belt. Slumping into the ditch, he felt dull pain that bubbled flesh along his shoulder blade. There was no blood. Blast fire cauterized whatever it hit. There was shouting and panic. More panic.
I might do my next live on TikTok and test the waters with that one as well.
Nearest to him, with point-blank shots to the back of the head, as others scrambled to get out of his way.
Or do I stick with YouTube? I could do something different for TikTok. I don't know.
Corbeck leapt to his feet, horrified at what he saw. He swung his lasgun into his shoulder, took careful aim and shot Drayle in the middle of the chest. Drayle barked out a cough and flew backwards with his feet and hands pointing out, almost comically. There was a pause. Corbeck
Did
edged
you
forward,
change?
as did McCall and most of them there.
Yeah, I think I get you there.
To try and help those that Drayle had lost, who were still alive. For God's sake,
I'll just have to see what works.
forward towards the corpse of the dead guardsman. What the hell is going on? McCall didn't answer. He crossed the concourse with several fierce bounds, slammed into
Maybe some orange Poxwalkers as well.
Drayle wasn't dead. Something insidious and appalling was blistering and seething inside the sack of his skin. He rose, first from the hips, and then to his feet. By the time he was standing,
SP on my
his
orc.
uniform and skin, splitting to accommodate the twisting, enlarging skeletal structure that was transmuting within him. Corbeck didn't want to look. He didn't want to see the bony thing which was erupting from Drayle's flesh. Watery blood and fluid spat from Drayle as the chaos infected.
I'm actually using a makeup brush to dry brush, man.
Something that burst out and stepped free of the shredded carcass that it had once inhabited. Drayle, or the thing that had once been Drayle, faced
I'm gonna have some really fucking shaky hands in a bit.
a vast and grotesque skeletal form whose bones seemed as if they had been welded from tarnished sections of steel. The head was huge, topped by polished horns that twisted irregularly.
Alright, where's my
Blood and other
Agrax?
unnameable fluids dripped from its structure. It looked like it was smiling. It turned its head from left to right.
This is like schizophrenia, man. Where
Corbeck saw that despite the fact that all fabric and flesh had dripped
Cheers, dude.
taken away, the obscenity still wore his dog pants.
What the
The
hell?
beast reached up,
Oh, there it is.
claws, and screamed at the sky. Get into cover!
Typhus has fallen over.
Screamed to his terrified men, and they fled into every shadow and crevice they could find. Corbeck and McCall dropped into a culvert. The scout
I'll probably keep painting till
Along
about
with a damp
7.
drainage channel, Corbeck could see Trooper Mellier, who carried the company's rocket launcher. The man was too terrified to move. Corbeck slithered down to him through the fetid suit and tried to pull the rocket launcher from his shoulder. Mellier was too limp and too scared to let it go easily. McCall, help me for fat's sake! Corbeck shouted as he wrestled with the weapon. It came free. He had it in his hands, the unruly weight of the heavy weapon unfamiliar to his shoulders. A quick check told him it was primed and armed. A shadow fell across him. The beast that was no longer Drayle stood over him and hissed with glee through its blunt, equine teeth. Corbeck fell on his back and tried to aim the rocket launcher, but it was wet and slippery in his hands, and he slid in the mud of the culvert. He began to mutter, "Holy Emperor, deliver us from the darkness of the void. Guide my weapon in your service. Holy Emperor, deliver us from the darkness of the void." He squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. Damp was choking the baffles of the firing mechanism. The thing
I don't know, I've
reached
got to
down
sit and
towards
wait for
him,
this to
but
dry so I can put another coat on.
Corbeck was lifted up out of the channel, dangling at arm's length from the abomination. But the baffles were now clear. He squeezed the trigger mechanism again, and the blast took the beast's head off at point-blank range. The explosion somersaulted Corbeck back 20 paces and dumped him on his back in a pile of mud and slag. The rocket launcher skidded clear. Headless, the obscenity teetered for a moment, and then collapsed into the culvert. Sergeant Grell was right behind with a dozen men that he had roused out of their panic with oathing taunts. They stood around the lip of the culvert and fired their las guns down at the twitching skeleton. In a few moments, the sculptural, metallic form of the beast was reduced to shrapnel and slag. Corbeck looked on a moment longer, then flopped back and lay prostrate. Now he had seen everything. He couldn't quite get over the idea that it had been his fault all along. Grail had been contaminated by that fragment, the damned statuette. Get a grip, he hissed to himself.
All right, thank you.
Men need you. His teeth chattered. Rebels, bandits, even the foul orcs he could manage. But this, the bombardment continued over and behind them. Close at hand, the drum machines continued to patter out their staccato message. For the first time since the fall of Tanith, weary beyond measure, Corbeck felt tears in his eyes. 3. Evening fell. The shriven bombardment continued as the light faded. A roaring forest of flames and mud pools, 300 kilometers wide. Gaunt believed he understood the enemy tactic. It was a double-headed win-win maneuver. They had launched their offensive at dawn in the hope of breaking the Imperial front line, but expecting stiff opposition which Gaunt and his men had provided. Failing to break the line, the Shriven had then countered by falling back far further than necessary, enticing the Imperial Guard forward to occupy the Shriven front line, and place themselves in range of the Shriven's artillery batteries in the hills. Lord Militant General Revere had assured Gaunt and the other commanders that 3 weeks of carpet bombing from orbit by the Navy had pounded the enemy artillery positions into scrap metal, thus ensuring comparative safety for an infantry advance. True enough, the mobile field batteries used by the Shriven to harry the Imperial lines had taken a pasting, but they clearly had much longer range fixed batteries higher in the hills, dug into bunker emplacements, impervious even to orbital bombardment. The weapons that were throwing the shells their way were Leviathans, and Gaunt was not surprised. This was a Forge world after all. Though insane with the doctrines of chaos, the Shriven were not stupid. They had been spawned among the engineers and artisans of Fortis Binary, trained and schooled by the tech priests of Mars. They could make all the weapons they wanted, and they had had months to prepare. So, here it was, a finely executed battlefield trap, drawing the Tanith First, the Vitrian Dragoons, and Emperor knew who else across no man's land into abandoned trench lines and fortifications where a creeping curtain of shell fire would slowly pull back, a meter at a time, and obliterate them all. Already the front line of the Shriven's old emplacements had been destroyed. Only hours before, Gaunt and his men had fought hand-to-hand down those trenches to get into the Shriven lines. Now, the futility of that fighting seemed bitter indeed.
Welcome to the live, whoever's
The
here.
ghosts with Gaunt,
How do you all
the company
do?
of Vitrian Dragoons with whom they had joined up, were sheltering in some ruined manufacturing spaces, a kilometer or so from the creeping barrage that was coming their way. They had no contact with any other Vitrian or Tanith unit. For all they knew, they were the only men to have made it this far. Certainly, there was no sign or hope of a supporting maneuver from the main Imperial position. Gaunt had hoped the wretched Jantine patricians, or perhaps even some of Draveer's elite stormtroops, might have been sent in to flank them. But the bombardment had put paid to that possibility. The electromagnetic and radio interference of the huge bombardment was also cutting their comm lines. There was no possible contact with headquarters or their own frontline units, and even short-range Voxcast traffic was chopped and distorted. Colonel Zoran was urging his communications officer to try to patch an uplink to any listening ship in orbit in the hope that they might relay their location and flight. But the upper atmosphere of a world where war had raged for half a year was a thick blanket of petrochemical smog, ash, electrical anomalies, and worse. Nothing was getting through. The only sounds from the world around them were the concussive rumble of the shell, and the background rhythm of the incessant drum. Gaunt wandered through the dank shed where the men were holed up. They sat huddled in small groups, camo cloaks pulled around them against the chilly night air. Gaunt had forbidden the use of stoves or heaters in case the enemy rangefinders. Colonel Zoran gave up on his radio efforts. And walked between his men to confront him.
Have I got any
In the shadows
screw?
of the shed, his dark-skinned face was hollow. What do we do, Commissar? Deferring to Gaunt's brain.
Oh, I've got some fudge.
Gaunt's breath caught the air as he lay in the gloomy shed. He shook his head. If we're to die, he said, then let us die usefully at least. There have been 400 men between us now. Our direction has been chosen for us. Zoran frowned, as if perplexed. How so? To go back walks us into the bombardment. To go either left or right along the line of the fortification will take us no further from that curtain of death. There is only one way to go, deeper into their lines, forcing ourselves back to their new front line, and maybe doing whatever harm we can once we get there. Zoran was silent for a moment, then a grin split his face. Even white teeth glinted in the darkness. Clearly, the idea appealed to him. It had a simple logic and an element of honorable glory that Gaunt had hoped would please the Vitrian mindset. When shall we begin?
I've got Kinder Bueno.
Buckling his mesh gauntlets back in place. The Shriven's creeping bombardment will have obliterated this area in the next hour or so. Any time before then would probably be smart. As soon as we can, in fact. Gaunt and Zoran exchanged nods and quickly went to rouse their officers and form the men up. In less than 10 minutes, the fighting unit was ready to move. The Tanith had all put fresh power clips into their lasguns, checked and replaced where necessary their focusing barrels, and adjusted their charge settings.
I'm not sure, dude.
As per Gaunt's
Not sure.
The silver blades of the Tanith war knives attached to the bayonet lugs of their weapons were blackened with soil to stop them flashing. Camo cloaks were pulled in tight, and the ghosts divided into small units of around a dozen men, each containing at least one heavy weapons trooper. Gaunt observed the preparations of the Vitrians. They were drilled into larger fighting units of about 20 men each, and had fewer heavy weapons. Where heavy weapons appeared, they seemed to prefer the plasma gun. None of them had melter guns or flamers as far as Gaunt could see. The ghosts would take point, he decided. The Vitrians attached spike-bladed bayonets to their lasguns, ran a synchronized weapons check with almost choreographed grace, and adjusted the charge settings of their weapons to maximum. Then, again in unison, they altered a small control on the waistband of their armor. With a slight shimmer in the darkness, the finely meshed glass of their bodysuits flicked and closed, so that the interlocking teeth were no longer the shiny, ablative surface, but showed instead the dark, matte reverse side. Gaunt was impressed. Their functional armor had an efficient stealth mode for movement after dark. The bombardment still shuddered and roared behind them, and it had become such a permanent feature, they were almost oblivious to it. Gaunt conferred with Zoran as they both adjusted their micro-beam detectors. Use channel Kappa, said Gaunt, with channel Sigma in reserve. I'll take point with the ghosts. Don't lag too far behind. Zoran nodded that he understood. I see you have instructed your men to set charge at maximum, Gaunt said as an afterthought. It is written in the Vitrian art of war. Make your first blow sure enough to kill, and there will be no need for a second. Gaunt thought about this for a moment. Then, he turned to lead the combat. 4. There were just two realities. The blackness of the foxhole below, and the brilliant inferno of the bombardment above. Trooper Catherine and the Vitrian cowered in the darkness and the mud at the bottom of the shell hole, as the fury raged overhead, like a firestorm in the face of the sun. Secret theft. I don't think we'll get out here alive, Catherine said darkly. The Vitrian didn't cast him a glance. Life is a means towards death. Our own death may be reckoned as much as that of our foe. Catherine thought about this for a moment, shook his head, sadly. Why you? A philosopher? The Vitrian trooper, Sogat, turned and looked at Kefren disdainfully. He had the visor of his helmet pulled up. Kefren could see little warmth in his eyes. The Baihaka, the Vitrian art of war. It is our codex, the guiding philosophy of our warrior caste. I do not expect you to understand. Kefren shrugged. Most stupid. Go on. How is war an art? The Vitrian seemed unsure if he was being mocked, but the language they had in common, Low Gothic, was not the native tongue of either of them. Kefren's grasp of it was better than Zogat's. Culturally, their worlds could not have been more different. The Baihaka contains the practice and philosophy of warrior. All Vitrians study it and learn its principles, which then direct us in the arena of war. Its wisdom informs our tactics, its strength reinforces our arms, its clarity focuses our minds, and its honor determines our victory. It must be quite a book.